It is capitalism. It is income and wealth inequality. It is speculation and commodification of an essential need, which is shelter for people. This is a great way to section into a topic I'd already wanted to talk about, which is that there has now been some polling on this. Doesn't look that good for the abundance people. This is a demand progress poll. You can find some recaps of it in like Axios. They wrote it up, but I wanted to give the exact wording from the poll itself, where they label the anti-billionaire, anti-corporate view for the Democrats as populist. I wouldn't do that, but sure, for the sake of argument, we're going to use the word populist, and they explain how they describe it to the participants. So this is how they describe abundance. And they ask basically if it makes people more or less likely to vote for a candidate. The big problem is bottlenecks that make it harder to produce housing, expand energy production, or build new roads and bridges. Frequently, these bottlenecks take the form of well-intended regulations meant to give people a voice or protect the environment, but these regulations are exploited by organized interest groups and community groups. Interest groups and community groups, to slow conflating
the groups.
Yeah, community groups with interest groups that represent industries is problematic in and of itself because it flattens the power dynamic that is completely unequal. This increases costs and makes it harder for us to provide for everybody's needs. And so, if a candidate for Congress or president made the abundance argument, would that make you more or less likely to vote for them? So much more likely is 12.6%, and somewhat more likely is 30.9%.
Can you just hold on
Sure.
The partisan splits for much more likely? 9.9 for Dem, 16.4 for Republican, 12.5 for Independent.
But even if we're just going to categorize it as more likely, right? So we take the top two categories and bunch them together. That's around, you see 42% more likely for Republican voters. This is why Josh Shapiro and centrist liberals are embracing this. This is another
Jared Polis.
Quadruple down on the horrible strategy that has lost Democrats elections repeatedly when Trump has been on the ballot, which is appealing to suburban Republicans. There's a reason that number for somewhat more likely, 42.4%, is really the best figure that they have here in terms of who is more likely to vote for the abundance agenda. It's that cohort of Republicans. And then for independents in total, for much more likely and some more likely, you can say that's around 40%. Okay. But let's go to the other one, populist, how they define it. The big problem is that big corporations have way too much power over our economy and our government. They work to prevent the government from making investments in things like expanding access to affordable clean energy, housing, and infrastructure improvements so they can maximize their own profits. Corporations also try to raise prices by as much as they can, which is easier than ever because the economy is so concentrated in the hands of just a few people. We need to hold these corporations accountable and reduce their power so the government and economy can work better for working and middle-class Americans. Now, how do voters respond to that? That's a much better figure for the total for independents in terms of making it more likely. So it's around 40% for abundance, 55% roughly.
But it doesn't get Republicans happy.
Well,
Republicans, not as enthused.
Well, I would also just to that point highlight that these are all abstracted in the survey. And so theoretically, something like abundance, when you describe it, might appeal to Republicans. But once it's attached to a Democratic Party candidate, it won't. That's like the downside of this kind of testing, because like a lot of people vote based on party lines or are less likely to believe certain statements from someone of another party, even if they overall would agree with the statement if it was coming from someone else. At the same time, one other thing I would highlight about the difference between populism or their populist definition explanation in the difference in the abundance and how it was received. Significantly more people, especially Dems and independents, were not able or unsure about like how it would impact their vote on a candidate. And I think that's because it's confusing. You know, it's also a very confusing, very technocratic position that there are some buzzwords in there that appeal to Republicans, like, oh, overregulation and special interest groups are using it as a weapon, blah, 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 blah. But I think overwhelmingly, it would just be like another like overly complicated explanation for people to digest that ultimately doesn't resonate with what they're seeing.
Yes, and like I'm glad we have you on actually now for this, Brandon, because you know data, and you can help me with this. Like here for just compare the much more likely total. 12.6% of overall total voters for abundance say they're much more likely with that pitch to vote, to more than double that for populists.
But what about donors?
Yeah. And the much more likely thing, you see how that's a strong reaction, right? As opposed to the, okay, much more likely, but the somewhat more likely total is...
Talk to me about bottlenecks.
Right, is bigger because it's like, oh, this is a little mealy mouth. Next page is also good. Now that you've learned more about both perspectives, which do you agree with the most? Oh, God. Even if neither is exactly your belief. Abundance, 29.2%. Populist is 42.8%. And you see the splits there among Republicans. But independence, that's 28.4% to 44.3%. Isn't this the cohort of voters we're supposed to be targeting to win elections? Or do we need to quadruple down on the failing strategy of suburban Republicans? Because then we don't have to address class.
We are the popularists now.
We are. I am the popularist now.
When people say that, it always feels like an aspirational thing to say, right? That when they say that they're doubling down or they're positioning these policies for the independents, it always feels like they're trying to create this class of voter that just currently doesn't exist out there in any significant numbers. That these are the values of the people who are pushing these agendas. Like these are the values of people like Ezra Klein and Maddie Iglesias, but they're not representative of any wide swath of electorate. You know, they're overrepresented, or rather the people who they are representative of are overrepresented in media positions, but they're not like a big part of our electorate in any like meaningful sense. Just like the Never Trumpers aren't a big part of the, Republican Party. This is just like the albatross of like the moneyed elite pseudo erudite media class.
Right, exactly right. So can we put up the next question, Russ, if you have it there? Perfect. The one, just scroll up slightly here. Up, please. Yeah. Down. I'm sorry. Okay. Now just stay there. Stay there. Thank you. Imagine a candidate for Congress or president made the arguments below. This is the one that is like the top line headline, I think, for this survey. Would this make you more or less likely to vote for them? The thing we need to do to make the government and the economy do a better job of serving working and middle class Americans is to get money out of politics, break up corporate monopolies, and fight corruption. Look at that figure. Much more likely is nearly 50%. 48.5. That is a strong reaction, a strong positive response, would you say, Brandon, right?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's like, especially when you combine it with the second box of somewhat more likely, which is oftentimes what they do in survey results like this. It's an overwhelmingly preferred, in my experience, we would consider an overwhelmingly preferred statement. I would also, though, just highlight about something like this, too, that some of this stuff, despite being overly popular in a vacuum, is tempered, including with the Democratic Party, with a lack of belief in the fact that they will follow through with this. Because I think some people in response with this would say like, well, Democrats do say stuff like this sometimes. Why aren't they as popular as this would lead you to believe, right? We know that their popularity, their approval's in the toilet. And it's like, because ultimately after a while, people just stop believing that you are going to follow through with this sort of thing. But when they do believe that a candidate is going to follow through with these things and they say them, they are more popular. Look at Bernie. Like people believed it when Bernie said it, and like this was the kind of this was the result. The popularity was.
So here I'll let this go in just a sec, but this is just such a jarring statistic here. Okay, the thing we need to do to make the government and I read that the much more likely 48.5%. Independent, it's 49% in total, so slightly higher. But when you pair it with somewhat more likely, that's nearly 85% of independents that say they're more likely to vote for a candidate that talks about getting money out of politics, breaking up corporate monopolies, and fighting corruption. You see that there, right? 49 plus 38.5. That is the figure. And then scroll just below to compare it to the independent numbers of the second question. There, go back up a slightly, Russ, you had it. Perfect. The thing we need to do to make the government and economy do a better job of serving working and middle class Americans is to reduce regulations that hold back the government and private sector from taking action. 18.8% much more likely to 48.5%. And those independent numbers taken together, I mean, what, some quick math there makes it like
44.
45? 43? Yeah.
44.9.
Yeah. Thank you, Brandon. So, huge difference. It's nearly double. I mean, I think our point is made for us here. There we go.
Believe science is all I can say. You know, believe science.
I got nothing to say on this other than, like, you know, it's
surprising.
I mean, it's the poll sort of lays out perfectly, like, exactly who this audience is for, who the audience this is for, right? I mean, wow, what a shocker! Your entire supposed liberal, way of going about this is to attack government regulation. And whoa, you mean your audience for this is Republicans and not anyone left of center? Wow, I'm shocked. What a surprise.
What a surprise.
That's like the whole thing here. Like, this is an entire project that's created to somehow sort of convince anyone left of center that the problems that they're facing are with the government and not with the private corporate interests that are, who own the properties and are responsible for so much of this. I mean, it's if parts of this, were actually legit and they actually made sense, they're basically forcing you to throw even those sensible parts out, with the fact that their whole underlying message of it all is these, what's the word they use? Bottlenecks, right? That's
bottlenecks, regulations, yeah. Right? And we just had Taylor Lorenz on to talk about how 2020 was such a radicalizing moment for people because it showed what the government could do. Eviction moratoriums, expanded child tax credit. We cut child poverty by half in some estimates, but by 40% in most. And then that was all taken away. The idea that a Democratic Party should be making the argument that government regulations are the problem in this moment where people are screaming for the government to be more responsive to them because they understood how it could be in the pandemic is political suicide.
No, I mean, I disagree, Emma. I think everyone sees Trump running roughshod over the Constitution and all of our law enforcement institutions, and they go, we need less regulation. It should be easier for the Republicans to destroy everything. It should be easier. I mean, I just think generally the kind of liberalism that this whole abundance plan represents is just dead on arrival for a lot of people. I think that obviously you can find some Republicans who are sympathetic to the message of less regulation, but not from a Democratic messenger, and everyone else is no longer in the place where their material conditions are such that allow for them to enjoy prosperity under a party that is pitching this kind of mealy-mouthed social liberation unattached from economic redistribution of resources, led by the government, along with like fiscal conservative talking points about like deregulating and unleashing the private sector. It's like for that, like, I think second, that latter point to land, people's conditions just have to be a little bit better for them to be, able to obscure the fact that they are at odds with that the workers are at odds in terms of what they need in their lives with the bosses that are ruling over them.
It is funny how the blowback to like this specific poll has been too online. Like when you see the abundance people getting mad about the poll, saying it's a garbage poll, and it's literally like this is actually a perfect showcase of a good, like, how a poll should be, in terms of they're not using like the buzzwords that can be defined based on what your understanding of something is. This is them literally putting the definition in front of you without labeling it anything and giving you the two options, and people are not liking the abundance option once it's explained to them beyond the buzzword abundance. But
And we see also how public sentiment is, not to bring it back to this, but with Israel, I mean, the public wants this slaughter to stop. The public wants, Democratic voters at the very least, and independents are very negatively polarized, much more so on Israel than was initially the case. It's now the majority opinion, according to most polls, that they view Israel more negatively now. And you don't see that kind of responsiveness from the party that for the past 4 years was saying they were going to respond to polls as opposed to changing polling themselves. Now, when the polls say things they don't like, well, it's time to disregard them.
Well, I don't know if you noticed, but there's been a number of polls that have changed the wording. It's no longer who do you have more sympathy for, the people of Israel, the people or the Palestinians? The wording is now who do you support? The people of Israel or Hamas?
And
that's
yeah.
Right.
And even those numbers are tightening.
Yeah. They've replaced the Palestinian people with Hamas. And then when people hear that and they're like, well, I don't support Hamas, obviously, and so I guess I'll say the other option. Then they use that to be aha, that idea that the tide is turning on Israel is false. And it's no, use the correct comparison of the Palestinians and you'll get the response that you don't like again.
It's just not survey best practices to use non-neutral language that way. But I would just point out to your previous point, Emma, about the pundit class. Oftentimes they're cloistered into social circles of people who occupy the same strata of the social economic status as they do, and they navigate those spaces. They chit chat at those cocktail parties. They take in the opinions of their friends and they kind of treat them as though they are insights into the broader population. They do a very lazy form of social science where they treat the insights of people within their direct social circle as though they are insights into the broader patterns that exist in the world out there. And then they come into stark contradiction with reality, and they don't like that because it didn't, it raises the question of what value do they serve if they don't represent anybody with these opinions that they're sharing.
They're pouring millions and millions of dollars into finding new ways to manipulate the public into not wanting to to aggressively redistribute wealth from the top 0.01%, 0.1%, 1% to the rest of the
That's the other
country. And they're going to, more consultants get paid because they're going to try to find some other way to lie to you, but just a little bit more, I don't know.
In a vacuum.
With a man saying it.
In a vacuum, I don't like that it costs whatever to build public housing, but I got to say, we can find the money for that.
Yeah.
And if it has to go in places where, land costs a lot or whatever, then it's more money from the rich people that are actually funding, maybe not the Ezra Derek Thompson abundance, but a good chunk of the other prominent abundance supporters on the libertarian side that say, don't regulate AI for the next 10 years and that sort of shit, instead of maybe we should just have, open hospitals.
Right. Scary Mountain Wizard. Goodness, MR crew, could you be any more fucking granular? Duber, 100% what Brandon said. Republicans might agree with the economic agenda of abundance and then vote for a Republican because of single issue cultural issues like guns, abortion, immigration, etc.
I'm convinced the polling stuff was only ever just hey, can we throw trans people and immigrants under the bus?
Basically.
Polls point that way, and that'd be easy for us to do.
Right. But it is just so fascinating to see. I think when you point it out, you show how, one, their premise in practicality isn't even effective in practical terms. But B, how big of liars they are.
It's not a real commitment.
Yeah.
Hey folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.